first industries that come to mind when you think of the climate crisis? More likely than not, the energy and transport sectors are among them. Reducing reliance on fossil fuels, of course, has been amongst the biggest objectives for solving the crisis. But the agriculture industry is also one of the most harmful. It's responsible for as much as 30% of the world's greenhouse gases. But its role in global warming arguably attracts much less attention and far fewer ambitious goals for reducing harm. For more on this, George Monbiot joins me on Perspective. He's a journalist and the author of Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet, which was just published in French here in France. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So what is it about the farming industry, in your view, that's so much more harmful than the others? You've described it as the most destructive thing that humans can do to the planet.
Yes, well, quite aside from its massive greenhouse gas emissions and climate impacts, it's the biggest use of land in the world. And every hectare of land we use for our own purposes is a hectare not used for wild ecosystems. Biggest user of water by a very long way, massively damaging habitats. It's the biggest cause of habitat destruction, the biggest cause of species loss as well. It's got this huge ramifying impacts around the world. Now, obviously, we need farming. We need to be fed. But there's a sort of moral force field around farming which says we don't criticize anything it's doing. We don't talk about these enormous impacts. We focus, rightly enough, on the fossil fuel industry and other harmful sectors, but we give farming a free pass when it comes to its vast impacts. And it has to change. If it doesn't change, farming itself is at massive risk from environmental breakdown, let alone everyone who depends on it.
So I hear you say that we need farming. You're not calling for the abolition of farming then. Do you distinguish then between kind of small-scale farming, regenerative farming, people who produce just enough for their communities, and larger-scale, more industrial farming, or are all forms of it to some extent harmful in your view?
Actually, I don't think that's where the divide should lie. There's good farming and bad farming at all sorts of scales. The fundamental problem is actually livestock farming. That is the real issue. And whether it's small or large, livestock farming has a huge disproportionate impact on global systems. Now, we need to be producing sufficient food for everyone. And a lot of that food will have to be moved around the planet because in a lot of places where people live in huge numbers, there just isn't enough fertile land to feed them. But we need to do it as efficiently and with the minimum impact that we possibly can. And the best thing you can do to reduce your environmental footprint is to stop eating animal products. They have this hugely disproportionate impact on the world's living systems.
So we've talked about how it affects the climate, but you also draw parallels between the global food system and the global financial system. So I think there's also kind of an ethical component to your argument. You said it's amongst the most concerning parts of this industry. What are some of the concerns there? What are we facing in that respect if nothing's done?
So it's showing very similar signs to the sort of systemic instability that we saw in the finance sector leading up to 2008. And it seems to be driven by very similar forces, massive corporate concentration. So, for instance, 4 corporations now handle 90% of global grain trade. That's a catastrophe. I mean, they've become too big to fail in the same way that the banks have become. And there's all sorts of other ways in which it's becoming more homogenous. There's less spare capacity. There are less walls in the system so that a shock somewhere gets amplified right the way across the system. Now, when the financial system was in danger of collapsing, governments were able to bail it out with future money. Quantitative easing was the production of future money. You cannot bail out the food system with future food. This is by far the greatest of all the systemic failures within human-made systems that we face. And yet again, nobody's talking about these aspects.
So we'll get to one of the solutions that you propose then that I think is probably the source of a lot of the controversy. It's probably a hard sell, still a hard sell for a lot of people. That is bacteria. Can you tell us more about how we can use bacteria for food?
Well, for 12,000 years, we've been breeding multicellular organisms, animals and plants, to produce all our food. And we've pushed them really to the limits of efficiency. But there are millions of single-celled organisms which we haven't even begun to explore their enormous food potential. And some of them, you can produce far more food with far less effort, far less space, far less water, far less land, far less fertilizer, far less of everything in a contained system so it doesn't spill out into the living world. Now, we already eat loads of bacteria every day. It's all over our food. We deliberately introduce live bacteria into cheese, into yogurt. But what we haven't been doing is saying, let's look at some bacteria which could be food sources in their own right. And some of them turn out to be highly nutritious, and you can use them to make a huge potential range of foodstuffs. We could be on the verge of a massive culinary revolution as profound as the dietary shift which was caused when we developed agriculture.
This has been the subject of a lot of controversy. I'm curious to know what are some of the most recurring criticisms of your arguments? Either what do you say to them, or have any of them actually made you rethink any part of your arguments?
Well, I'm always rethinking everything. We have to. We just can't afford to be complacent, to be locked into our mindsets. But what I hear all the time is, I'm not going to eat bugs. Well, tough, you eat them with every meal. Sorry, you're already doing it. And one response I've got to the people who are horrified by the idea of eating bacteria is to say, imagine it was the other way around. Imagine we were already eating microbes, and then I came along and suggested we started eating animals instead. You know, we got this, there's some wild pigs, we could domesticate those, and wild cows and wild chickens, and we could change their characteristics and pack them into massive sheds and treat them appallingly and slaughter 80 billion of them every year. And then we could take them to another big factory and stun them and cut their throats and pluck them and skin them and chop them up into bloody chunks, and you can eat the product. People would be absolutely disgusted by that idea. But we've normalized the way we treat animals to the extent that if you treated dogs and cats the way we treat pigs and chickens, you would be sent to prison. But it's totally normal to treat vast numbers of animals in this appallingly cruel way.
But what about the criticisms that, for example, producing food in factories, labs, would also concentrate the production capacities in the hands of a few, or even the criticism, this notion that, you know, these would be ultra-processed foods? We're starting to get more information about how harmful ultra-processed foods are to our body. At the end of the day, we need fruit, we need vegetables, we need fresh food. So how do you address those criticisms?
No, I'm not talking about substituting fruit, vegetables, and other plant products at all. I'm talking about substituting animal products. And yes, there is a genuine danger of corporate concentration, as there is everywhere. We need to have strong antitrust laws and weak intellectual property rights, because this could be a great gift to the world, these new technologies. We can't afford for them to be concentrated in the hands of a few corporations, just as the old technologies have been. As for the ultra-processed thing, you can make far less processed substitutes for animal products than you can from plants. I mean, using plants to make animal substitutes, you need a lot of processing because plants are so different. But a lot of microbes are much, much closer. So, for instance, I was in a laboratory in Amsterdam recently where they found a bacteria which is pink and tastes and smells exactly of sausages. And so you actually need less processing to make sausages out of those bacteria than you do to make sausages out of pigs.
I can't say that sounds appetizing, but I'm open to it. We've got less than a minute left, George, but I want to ask you one last thing. If we put these radical solutions aside for a second, is part of the issue simply that we've gotten used to consuming whatever we want, whenever we want? Is maybe moderation not just something that we need to kind of ingrain into the minds of consumers more so than a radical overhaul of what we do eat?
Well, we need to do both. And we really are in such an urgent situation now. I mean, we've got not just a climate emergency, but an Earth systems emergency. We need to do both. We need to become much more conscious and aware consumers, but we also need to change the system.
Georges Monbiot, author of Feeding the World Without, Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet, which again is out in French now for our French-speaking viewers. Thank you very much for joining us on France 24 today.
Thank you so much.